Hi everyone. Good morning, good day, good evening, depends where you're watching us from. Welcome to this broadcast. My name is Grigory Frolov. I'm Vice President of Free Russia Foundation. Today, I'm actually really happy about our event today because that's a great reason to wear a tie and a jacket, and there are not so many reasons doing the homework in these days. So that's already something really important to me. But way more important is that the topic of the report, which we present today, the one on malign influence of Putin's Russia, and the great panel of experts that are joining us today. We have Anton Shekhovtsov, Free Russia Foundation Senior Fellow and author of Russia and the European far-right Tango Noir, the classical book on Russia influence on the European political institutions. Before we moving towards actual presentation, I just want to say a couple of words. Free Russia Foundation was working on and following Kremlin's activities abroad pretty much since the establishment of our foundation and since the beginning of our activities. That was one of the core things we was watching and analyzing and publishing reports on this. Last year, we had a flagship project called Misrule of Law. Basically, last year we brought together like a dream team of experts from US, Russia, and Europe to publish this report together. This one is on Kremlin influence on the legal institutions around the world and on disinformation campaigns. We presented this paper all around the world, and I think this activity was the most targeted by Kremlin bots and Kremlin media in the whole story of our foundation. I mean, we like the DDoS attacks was all the time, and we really struggled to go through it, but of course we did. And this massive reaction actually moved us to put our work on the next level. And this year we are starting a new project called Kremlin Influence Quarterly. It's going to be a quarterly journal on the Kremlin influence in European Union, in countries of Eastern European Partnership, and on the Western Balkans countries. We will try to analyze all aspects of the Russian malign influence there. And before to start this big work, we asked Anton to actually conceptualize the theory of malign influence and create this roadmap to analyze it. And so because of this, we have this report called Conceptualizing Malign Influence of Putin's Russia in Europe. And so now I think it's time to move forward and give Anton the floor to present the report. Right after that, we want to be joined by Maria Snegovaya and Melissa Hooper to discuss the paper. So Anton, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Greg, thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for publishing this report. I think it's going to be useful for many of experts in our field. Basically, I started this report because I wrote several pieces of Kremlin's influence in Europe, and I was not satisfied with all of them. Basically, basically because the chaos with terms and definitions and categories. And as a political science, I like categorize everything. I want to put everything in a box, give it a name on this box, and use it when needed. So this paper, it's mostly theoretical, and let me start with saying that influence, because influence is in the center of this paper. Influence, as such, it's something quite neutral. Influence is the power to have an effect on people or things. Yeah? And it would not be an exaggeration to say that all the states in the world, to one degree or another, they try to exert influence on other states. And this is totally okay. Joseph Nye wrote a brilliant book that became a seminal in the field on soft power. And soft power, I think in many reports, unfortunately today, soft power is misunderstood. Soft power is a good thing. Soft power is the ability to influence through affinity and attraction with resources such as nations' political values, culture, and foreign policies. When a state tries to exert influence through soft power, it means that it shares some values. If a state tries to influence Western nations, it appeals to shared values. So I would say that influence emanating from soft power is normatively positive. And to repeat myself, just when a state tries to influence the behavior of other states by appealing to shared universal values and common interests, it effectively strengthens the universal value system, thus contributing to the building of a global culture of human rights and achieving long-term balance and stability and international relations. So even authoritarian states, such as Putin's Russia, in times of peace, authoritarian regimes build their relations with democratic societies predominantly on the basis of traditional and public diplomacy, trade and cultural exchange, which implies the employment of soft power on the part of authoritarian regimes, no matter how limited their access to this soft power is. However, in a situation of crisis, something that we are witnessing today, nations tend to deform all areas of cooperation they enjoyed during peacetime. So traditional public diplomacy, they're poisoned by the downgrading of communications and projections of hard power. Routine trade is crippled by sanctions and trade wars, and soft power degenerates into many experts in our field called sharp power, which is about manipulation and disinformation. This is also dark power. It's about bullying other states, and it's about mimetic power, when authoritarian nations try to sort of appear normal to Western nations and say, well, let's go back to business as usual because we are not different from you. And if the crisis is not resolved very quickly, then what emerges is political warfare. And I think the concept of political warfare is quite useful in analyzing a malign influence. So political warfare is seen as a gray area between, on the one hand, regular political, diplomatic, economic, and other transactions, and on the other hand, high order war. So political warfare is something in between, and high order war, it's in other words, we can define it as a declared conventional war between the armed forces of two or more nation states. And in the slide, I want to show you how power and influence operate in different times. So during peacetime, we have soft power, we have traditional influence. When we have this political war, then we have projections of hard power, mimetic power, and something that is shared also with high order war. It's sharp power, dark power, and malign influence. So we define malign influence in the European context, and I must stress that the paper it mostly focuses on the European context. And on the next slide, I will give you a definition of what we consider malign influence. We define it as a specific type of influence that directly or indirectly subverts and undermines European values and democratic institutions. And we follow, with the European values, with that definition, we follow the Treaty on European Union, saying that European values are about human dignity, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, equality, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And democratic institutions, we consider them as the guardians of European values. And this list obviously is not full, but I think these are most important democratic institutions that malign influence attacks during political war. Representative political parties, free and fair elections, an impartial justice system, free and independent, pluralistic media, and robust civil society. So the main effect of malign influence is as it follows from the definition, is erosion and decline of European values, as well as deepening distrust of democratic institutions. But it's also important to stress why Putin's Russia would try to, why it engages in political warfare that and consequently produces malign influence. And before discussing these strategic objectives of Putin's Russia and political warfare, I must say that even before Putin's Russia started to wage a political warfare against the West, it first did this with its own population. The Russian society, I would say, was the first victim of Putin's regime. So the Kremlin started waging a political warfare first, as I said, against its own society. But then we can also see that many operations that the Kremlin is now is engaged in, attacking the West, we can see that they all were first tested on the Russian society. When we see that the Kremlin interferes in democratic elections in Europe, in the US, first the Kremlin interfered in the elections in Russia itself. And now they don't really have free and fair elections. The same with the media. When they try to manipulate the media in the West, first they try to do this, and they were quite successful. They manipulate the media in Russia. So, what are strategic goals of Putin's Russia in Putin's war, political war against the West? First, the first goal is to protect Russian society from Western ideological, political, cultural, and other influences that Putin's regime believes to be undermining the grip on power held by the Kremlin. And this goal is attained by discrediting European values and democratic institutions in the eyes of the Russian people. The second strategic goal is to advance the political, economic, and security interests of Putin's Russia on the international stage. These are strategic aims. There are also tactical aims, because these strategic aims they are achieved through a series or a number or a mix of different tactical objectives. These objectives include, but they are of course not limited to the weakening of Europe's transatlantic contacts, poisoning of bilateral relations between European states, spreading disorder on the international stage, retaining former Soviet states in the Russian sphere of influence, hindering modernization of democratizing European states, undermining trust in the EU and NATO. So it's important to distinguish, of course, between tools and of political warfare and areas of their application, although at times the difference between them is vague. And in the next slide, I will show you areas of Russian malign influence. And again, this is not exhaustive. Politics, diplomacy, military domain, business, media, civil society, academia, religion, crime, law. And I would add already now that we see malign influence also now in the area of medicine, of the pandemic situation that we find ourselves today. Many authoritarian states, including Russia, they're trying to wage a political warfare using the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Now, we also identify tools of Russian malign influence. In the next slide, you will see them. This is, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. Many other experts can add their own tools of Russian malign influence and political warfare. And just to name something that I was writing quite widely about political alliances, interference in elections, agents of influence, front organizations. But of course, organized crime can also be used for political purposes, for the purposes of malign influence. Religious politics, the same. Cybercrime, cyber warfare, we've seen that. Also, there are 8 major categories of Russian state and non-state operators, because this is important. We have tools of Russian malign influence or political warfare. We have areas where these tools are applied, but we also need to know who the operators are. And these operators, they can be state-sponsored, they can be state operators, and they also can be non-state operators. And so the next slide will show you these 8 major categories. So we have siloviki, and siloviki, as you may know, these are people. The word, the term comes from the term power, or sila in Russian. It's about power ministries, power institutions. Defense Ministry, main directorate of the General of the Armed Forces, Foreign Intelligence, Federal Security Service. So these are siloviki, power structures. Also be official structures, presidential administration, foreign ministry, Committee of International Affairs, or the State Duma. They all deal with different people, with different organizations in the West. They have their own areas of application where they apply these tools of political warfare. Then political forces, the major political forces, of course, the United Russia, sometimes the Communist Party, sometimes this far-right, misleadingly named party called Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is, again, an extreme right party. Business community can also be weaponized when needed. We know very well examples of the weaponization of the energy supplies, especially in Europe, and how Putin's Russia used energy to put pressure on European societies. State-sponsored media, we all know them very well. RT, Sputnik, and the new or relatively new far-left publication called Redfish. It's based in Germany, but it's a Russia-sponsored far-right medium. Then social media propaganda networks, Internet Research Agency, IRA, the so-called troll factory, run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, but not only him. There are smaller projects of troll factories and Russian web brigades, think tanks, foundations. First and foremost, Россотрудничество, which is very important. Then World Valdai Discussion Forum. It's a high profile think tank that also is engaged, is sometimes, very often, in political warfare. And traditionalist bloc is Russian Orthodox Church and various LGBT organizations. Then, of course, what's important is that all these operators, they can be broken down into categories. As I say, I like categories. Yeah, as a political scientist, I need to box everything in order to operate with these concepts. But what's interesting here is that, and this is how actually Putin's Russia differs so much from the West, is that at the time of a particularly acute crisis in the relations between Putin's regime and the West, all these operators can be momentarily mobilized and function as a single unit, no matter whether they're state or non-state entities. And I think this is extremely important. When the West tries to, counter the political warfare of the Kremlin, it maybe uses some foreign ministries can act against the Kremlin's interference, or think tanks. Producing reports. Tradition is blocked, but in Putin's Russia, all these operators can mobilize at once and become one, and this is quite important to understand, in my opinion. Now, and obviously, all these operators of malign influence, Russian operators of malign influence, they don't function in a vacuum. In the majority of cases, they are linked to Western and, in particular, European facilitators, and I call them facilitators of the Kremlin's political warfare. The next slide will show you some of them. So, siloviki, the power structures, they have access, in Europe, they have access to transnational organized crime, to paramilitary groups. They train some of them, or at least some people of those members of those paramilitary groups. Sometimes even biker gangs. Then official structures, like foreign ministry, they deal with agents of influence, friendly academics who are invited very often to Putin's Russia, experts and journalists, celebrities, producers. We know examples of them. Yeah, well, this is not an exhaustive list, but we know how it works. Political forces, they deal usually with friendly foreign political actors. The United Russia is very active in this. Political, for example, United Russia signed 2 cooperation agreements with at least 2 with far-right political parties in Europe. Then you have front organizations. That's also the facilitators of Russian malign influence. Business community deals with business partners of Russian companies. They also very often are mobilized to wage a political war or help or facilitate Russian political warfare against Europe. State-sponsored media, websites amplifying pro-Kremlin narratives, dozens of them, myriads of them, let's say. Social media propaganda networks, the same. Far-right, far-left conspiracy theories, internet activists, think tank foundations, the same. Their facilitators would be friendly academics, experts, journalists, and of course, facilitators of the Russian traditionalist bloc would be national Orthodox churches. Not all of them. No, I'm not trying to generalize here, but I would say some of them, especially some clerics belonging to these national Orthodox churches, they facilitate Putin's malign influence, and very often ultra-conservative and anti-LGBT organizations facilitate here as well. And drawing closer to the conclusions of my presentation, I want to now focus on so when we try to investigate the malign influence of Putin's Russia, we need to establish the context. Malign influence emerges, and I think this is important. This is important to stress again. We're not talking just about influence. We're talking about malign influence. So malign influence emerges during a crisis. It's not about peacetime. It's about a crisis between nations, and this crisis is perceived to move them into a situation inconsistent with peacetime relations, when they would try to change other nations' behavior or opinions by employing engagement or shaping strategies rather than disruptive or destructive strategies. In other words, malign influence is a product of the gray area of political warfare and cannot emerge during peacetime. It's also important to assess vulnerabilities of European states, because the Kremlin and pro-Kremlin actors are most likely to exploit those. And in the slide, the next slide will show you vulnerabilities of that can be exploited. The next slide, please. So corruption. Pro-Kremlin actors use corruption as a lubricant of malign influence operations. That's corruption is the most important, the most significant vulnerability in European states. The higher the corruption, the weaker the defenses are, and the more vulnerable this particular state to the Kremlin's malign influence. anti-system parties. Not all of them, but the more anti-system, anti-establishment parties there are in a European country, the weaker, again, the weaker their defenses are. Because it's about polarization, it's about amplification of social and societal divisions, economic dependence. We all know that, especially with energy, the more dependent a European state on Putin's Russia in terms of energy, the weaker the defenses are, and again, the higher the vulnerability. Social inequality, again, this is important. A high level of social inequality make European societies more vulnerable. Historical links, again, very important. And in general, political culture is very important. There are nations that were close and probably are still close for historical reasons to Russia. And with this closeness comes, I would say, very often, vulnerability and high degree of manipulation on the part of the Kremlin. Weak democracy, again, and the weak media. If a state does not have independent media, if the media are totally in a country totally bought up by the oligarchs, who may have some business interests in Russia, it means that media would not hold officials and politicians accountable. And let me conclude by saying that techniques and combinations of techniques used by the state and pro-Kremlin non-state actors in the framework of political warfare that's producing malign influence are innumerable. There are so many of them. For example, the Kremlin may interfere in elections in Western nations by building alliances with particular political forces, providing funding through shell companies and supporting them with the help of disinformation and cyber attacks against their opponents, something that we saw in the French presidential elections in 2017, when the Kremlin was supporting the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen and was attacking the centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron. Or Russian pro-Kremlin actors may attempt to drive wedges between social and cultural groups in European nations through simulated civil society, so-called civil society groups funded through organized crime. Or those actors may hack European think tanks that aim to counter the Kremlin malign influence operations and discredit them by publishing sensitive, non-public information. I know we all, many of us know examples of this. Or Russian intelligence services may provide training for paramilitary groups in European societies that could later be used for radicalizing peaceful democratic protests. So you see, these combinations, they may be myriads of them, and they all aimed at subverting European values and undermining European democratic institutions, which is this is the main effect of malign influence of Putin's Russia in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anton. And let me welcome our panelists. Dr. Maria Snegovaya, postdoctoral fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and an adjunct fellow on the Center of European Policy Analysis. Hi, Maria.
Hi, hello everyone.
And Melissa Hooper, Director of Europe and Eurasia Policy at Human Rights First, and what's very important, a member of the board of Free Russia Foundation. And before we move forward with our panelists, I just want to remind you that on the right side of the screen, you got a chat where everyone can text questions, and we will try to pick as much as we can and answer them. Also, you feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe to our channel and follow us for later events. So let's move forward. Melissa, let me give you a question first. You, for many years, work with obviously with the legal sphere of our life, and been analyzing a lot of Kremlin's effort on undermining the law and legal institutions and influence on European countries, particularly Eastern European countries, through the legal practices. Can you please, first of all, of course, share a couple of thoughts on the Anton's paper, and then provide us a little bit more information on this part of Russian malign influence, which is not as highlighted as, let's say, economical influence or the disinformation campaigns?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Greg Frolov and Free Russia Foundation for holding this event, and I'm also pleased that I get to appear alongside Anton Shekhovtsov and Maria Snegovaya. I admire both of their work. So I wanted to point out a few thoughts on the framework from the perspective of someone that does focus on rule of law, and also as an advocacy person who seeks to try to drive U.S. foreign policy that aims at limiting and deterring Russian malign influence. So I'd like to note a few ways that I find the framework helpful from those perspectives. And I would say initially, I am overall grateful that I hope that this framework can help move us once and for all away from the need to cite every single type of malign influence that we observe as an exhaustive list in our research papers, because there are many tools and many vectors, and I think that we are all trying to get a comprehensive handle on all of them. And so I hope that now we can say there are many tools and many vectors. See this framework, and we can move the conversation forward. So I would say that first, this framework helps us distinguish between the soft power that is used by pro-democracy European states to form a common language and to shape behaviors that promote European standards from what Russia is doing. I think that the term maskirovka that Anton uses is helpful in identifying these strategies as inherently deceptive and harmful from the perspective of European norms. And it's also helpful to note that there are strategies that are not available during peacetime, that they're reserved for a time when soft power isn't available for Russia to use, when its relationships and reputation have deteriorated. So it's operating from a position of weakness. So it's helpful then for us to know that when we say soft power, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that does not equate to what pro-democracy states are doing. Second, I think this is helpful in clearly identifying and distinguishing Kremlin's two main strategies with respect to malign influence. The first being to tarnish or subvert European rule of law norms and narratives so that they don't undermine Putin's power within Russia, and then to advance the Kremlin's political, economic, and security interests outside of Russia. I think it's important to be able to distinguish between those so that we know, for example, when the Kremlin is citing to the refugee crisis as a destabilizing force within Europe, or citing to an over-focus on LGBTQ rights as a way of the European framework undermining the rights of other people, for example, Orthodox people, that Russia is doing one thing, and when it's moving the International Investment Bank to Hungary, it's doing another thing, advancing its own political and economic interests. However, I would note, I think this framework helps us identify those things so that we can look at where both of those converge. And when we see those strategies, we know we need to pay attention. So for example, going back to the IIB, the International Investment Bank, I would say that that move serves both of those strategies because it tarnishes the European standards of rule of law by creating a faux multilateral organization within Europe with no accountability that likely serves as a source of money laundering, where it also advances Russian economic and intelligence interests by allowing the Kremlin to gather information while it has diplomatic immunity for any acts. Corruption, which was discussed, I think, as Anton pointed out, the most significant vulnerability. I think that engaging European leaders in corrupt deals such as the Paksh nuclear plant renovation. That was a contract for $14.5 billion given to Russian state company Rosatom without an open tender by Hungary or bribery of officials by Russians within Europe. The Russian laundromat is another example. These are all strategies that are subverting European norms while lifting up and advancing Russian financial and other economic goals. And so when we look at where the convergence of those two occurs, that's around rule of law and corruption. And so we see that that is where we need to focus a great deal of attention, is in bolstering the rule of law and combating corruption in the European states. And I would say in the West in general, because I would not exempt the US from that. And then finally, third, I think that this framework is helpful in that it engages in a mapping of the tools used and the issues of focus and operators and facilitators. And in doing that, it develops a very general formula, not saying that all of these pieces occur in every single vector of malign influence, but it identifies a framework that we can at least look to, so that we can try to identify where we see an operator. We can see, well, is there a facilitator? We should look to that. And it helps us, I think, number one, looking for those facilitators, and number two, thinking about our own vulnerabilities as facilitators. And I think that that's, again, where we see rule of law as a very important component. It's not just about people, but it's about our own systems. So there it points to, again, corruption as being an area where we need to do a lot of focus, but also areas where our own rule of law norms are faltering. So attacks on judiciaries. We talked, you referenced a bit earlier, Grigory, that that Free Russia Foundation has focused on how Russia is trying to exploit legal systems abroad. And Anton also mentioned this. If we have a country trying to exploit legal systems abroad and we are attacking our own judiciaries, I think Poland and Hungary are great examples of where we've seen a real deterioration of a judicial branch. We are opening the door to greater influence. And I would not exempt this to Poland and Hungary, but I would say also electoral politics, where our electoral laws and processes are faltering, is another area where we need to focus. So I think this strategy helps us identify areas where we do need to focus, and it makes clear that rule of law is a major one now, especially with COVID-19, where we're seeing countries use the pandemic as a strategy to grab more power through emergency powers laws. It makes rule of law even more important. And I think it's not only to combat Russian influence, but I would point out to combat foreign influence in general. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Okay, Melissa, thank you very much
for
this pretty extensive remark. Maria, I mean, first of all, I really would like you to follow up on the last words of Melissa, the COVID pandemic, and how Russia's disinformation campaign is now, the Russian disinformation campaigns, together with actually Chinese campaigns, are now trying to undermine the West through on the ground of this pandemic. But before that, obviously you've been working, analyzing the Russian disinformation campaigns for quite a few years, also particularly focusing on how Russia uses these tactics inside Russia first, and how Russia takes and builds the new strategies on the old Soviet strategies of disinformation campaigns and influence. So can you please talk a little bit on this in regards to the Anton paper, and then also follow up on the pandemic thing?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Free Russia Foundation and Anton, for this great opportunity. I think the topic is really important, and I really applaud Anton in this effort to systematize the knowledge on Russia's influence operations that I think is of great importance. So I actually wanted to start with the good news, because I think we'll lack any good news these days because of the news flow, to say that the fact that Anton points out as a motivation for doing this paper the fact that we have multiple research on the topic that's very prolific, but at the same time somewhat incongruent, and there is a need for general framework that actually brings together this different scholarship, is a good news, because it tells us that the initial strength of Russia's disinformation, Russia's influence operations in Europe, which was unpredictability, is largely gone. We do understand more or less what they're doing. There is substantive research on this topic, and hence the original strength and the leverage that Putin's regime possessed currently is weakened for them. In fact, Russia has become less unpredictable in its influence operations, and as a result, more toxic. I think we also, to follow up on your question, Greg, kind of see that dynamic unraveling during this pandemic crisis, when Russia does, the Putin's regime definitely tries to use this panic that spread over Europe and the United States in an effort to promote its own goals. But we see that there is actually, even despite all this crisis situation in which Western societies find themselves, there's a relatively strong backlash against this already. So I just quickly, since I do understand we have limited time, I will quickly highlight where I see the advantages of Anton's paper, where I would like to see more done, and some points about future research altogether. So first of all, as I mentioned before, I do agree that there's a lot of literature on the topic that does not necessarily all use the same definitions, and I really appreciate an effort to try to make it more congruent and develop a common theoretical framework. I would love, actually, Anton, to develop a little bit more on that. You know, maybe it's a little bit too scholarly approach of me, but I do like one that there is a very, very specific outline where the gap in the literature is. But I do think that we overall understand that this is the case. Overall, I agree with the analysis that is proposed. However, I think there is important future developments, dimensions where we could take this. So the most important one for me, as a scholar who works with empirical data, is operationalization. A lot of research on Russia's influence and disinformation has been primarily qualitative in nature. In this sense, Anton's paper really is not an exception. And I would love us to focus a little bit more on ways to operationalize all these very usefully summarized concepts that Anton proposes, because operationalization really commonly defines the final outcomes that we receive. Most important question that I think many scholars of this topic find themselves facing these days is, of course, how efficient these operations are. Without operationalizing this concept, so how do we measure, for example, weak media? Is it maybe a fragmentation of the media? Is it lack of public broadcasting? What else? We are likely to, find ourselves in the realm where everyone again understands different things by that, and essentially Putin's influence is everywhere. I think a good example of that is the recent New York Times article, again, about the pandemic, that essentially demonstrated that Putin has manipulated US public opinion to convince them that science doesn't matter over the years, and so hence we have this pandemic and nobody's ready to counter that. I think the evidence that was presented in the article, even if the endeavor is quite deserves a lot of credit, the evidence that has been presented there is not sufficient for us to, agree that Russia has really fundamentally alternated the views of the US societies on vaccination and on the need for scholarly research in the area of medicine. And I think that this is where really we have a fundamental void in the literature for the future research. Even despite all this talk about the influence operation and disinformation that Russia spreads, we don't really have a lot of studies that try to evaluate the efficiency of it. In particular, I really have done some research on this topic, trying to summarize the literature on how efficient Russia's disinformation has been. There's very few attempts that has been made as of now, and most of them, believe it or not, do not find any convincing arguments that it's the disinformation is that efficient. In fact, what the most studies demonstrate is that these operations tend to foster polarization in the societies where it already is in the first place, as indicated, for example, as Anton's paper demonstrates, by presence of these multiple radical political actors. But there is no direct evidence that just presenting fake news to a certain person online or in real life necessarily alternate this person's opinions on a certain topic. I think this is what we need to be studying more. And if it's not that direct, then how does it work? It's somewhat ironic that despite all the so-called disinformation, really, for all these years, for frankly already almost 10 years, we still don't have a good answer to this question. I haven't mentioned that in Anton's paper. I think I particularly applaud the effort to focus on vulnerabilities, susceptibility of given societies to these influence operations. I think we can expand this point. I think, again, this is where I would love to see more research done. In particular, Anton, you talk about social inequality, but I think there is also polarization of the society, as I mentioned before, one important aspect that that is missing. And of course, the media is not just the weakness of the media, but fragmentation of the media, the presence or absence of the public broadcasting that's widespread across the nation, and of course, social media and internet usage, because that is, at least in part, a big factor that allows the Kremlin to spread its message across so fast. So just to sum it up, I do appreciate the effort. I do believe that we will lack these attempts to get together the different streams of literature and kind of summarize the findings. I still believe there is a lot of areas that need to be studied better, in particular when it comes to personalization of the these influence operations and disinformation strategies, and measuring susceptibility of given societies to these efforts, as well as ultimately the effectiveness of this effort. And thank you very much for Free Russia for doing this. I'm hoping to see more of this research appearing in the future, thanks to your great think tank.
I hope I mean, we actually gonna have this the first quarterly by the end of this month, which is a big announcement, and I hope it's gonna be something very interesting, and we obviously gonna share it everywhere. But before that, I actually want to a couple more questions. The first one is to Anton and maybe to everyone, is about how the goals of the Kremlin malign influence varies in European countries and, let's say, in the countries of the former Soviet outer sphere. So what differs in tactics and what differs in long-term goals? And also, I'd like to pick one of the questions from the audience. That's the question from Ambassador Jan Kelly, who is asking about how Kremlin uses the Russian Orthodox Church as a tool for malign influence, and whether that's actually a big tool and an important mechanism for influencing, particularly in countries like Georgia or Ukraine or in the Balkan states.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start with this last question. As we know, Ukraine eventually acquired its own independent church, independent from the Moscow Patriarchate, and Moscow did use other Orthodox churches in Europe in order to somehow hinder the recognition of the Ukrainian independent church in the world. So that was the direct use of national Orthodox churches in order to put more pressure on Ukraine and keep Ukraine, or get Ukraine back to Russian sphere of influence. Not to let it modernize, not to let it democratize, and remain in this gray area somewhere between Russia and the European Union. So this, I think, is a clear example. I also think that because sometimes we see this in Georgia, we see this also in Ukraine again, and in the Balkans, how Orthodox circles, not necessarily the Russian Orthodox Church itself, but the circles close to Russian Orthodox Church, how they try to use homophobia in order to undermine democratization in those countries. How they try to somehow link democracy, liberal democracy, and LGBTQ movement, and they try to use this homophobia in order to discredit liberal democracy, and this we see in many cases. So not necessarily Russian Orthodox Church itself, but structures and circles close to it. Your first question, Greg, is also very interesting, because obviously there are differences in how Russia wages a political warfare and how it exerts malign influence on different countries in Europe and in different regions. I would say that, for example, in the case of Ukraine, Russia is more open. Yeah, it has very little to lose in the case of Ukraine. Russia is already waging an undeclared war, a limited war. It's not high order war, but still it's a limited war against Ukraine, and it uses all the available tools to undermine Ukraine's rapprochement with Europe. At the same time, I would say that, and this is open to debate, I would say that for Putin himself, Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe is not very interesting. What interests him most of all is the US and Western Europe. For Putin, as a former KGB officer, Eastern Europe is something that is not very important. This is not serious. We can use energy pressure against them, and they will follow us. For him, he doesn't see that the Central Eastern Europe is so serious about European values as well, because malign influence is about subversion of European values, and he sees it's like, I mean, it's not a fact, but he sees that the US and the European Union, especially Western Europe, is the bastion of those European values. If you subvert them, if you undermine their democratic institutions, then you can have everything. And I would say again that, and with the case of Ukraine and the Orthodox Church, how Russian Orthodox Church using other national Orthodox churches, it uses Central Eastern Europe to undermine Western Europe or undermine countries in these Eastern Partnership countries. Sometimes, using one country in order to, wage a political warfare against another. So it happens very often. For example, I think when Viktor Orban decided to block all Ukraine's contacts or high-profile contacts with NATO, I'm pretty sure that it wasn't just an independent decision by Viktor Orban. It's not a real coincidence that Russia would also like Ukraine to be far away from NATO. So, again, it's using Hungary against Ukraine. Sometimes other countries against other countries. So it's all complicated, and obviously there are differences. Again, to come back to your question, so that there are differences in tools and operators in different regions.
Okay.
Can I just quickly add? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Maria, go ahead.
Just thank you for an interesting question, Greg. I just wanted to point out one more thing. We don't very clearly distinguish between disinformation for kinetic action or influence operation for kinetic and non-kinetic actions. So I think that's one of the reasons why we need to study more the society's susceptibility to Russia. It's possible that kinetic action is taken as a continuation of this influence operation. So they actually naturally, merge and from one to another, especially given Russia's tendencies to use proxies, as we have seen in Ukraine, instead of direct open military intervention. Again, we don't there's a very deep area of research here that's not studied. Why kinetic in some cases and not kinetic in other cases? It's just because it cannot use kinetic. So that actually a little bit changes our approaches, right? So it will resort to kinetic course of action any way it could or not. Again, that's not necessarily what we see. So all kind of discussion in this area or more publications on this topic would be really, really welcome.
Okay, thank you. Melissa, would you like to add something too?
Sure. Just respect to the first question, I would note, Anton mentioned that there are organizations that are not the Russian Orthodox Church. The World Congress of Families, I think, is a good example, and that Russia has used that and its annual conferences to hold them in Hungary and Moldova and in Georgia, and there have been major incidents around those events, and that has led to a pushing of policies that then make it harmful for those countries in their relationships with the EU and with NATO. So they're specifically, pushing policies that are against European standards that then cause tension between those countries and the EU, and have made then conversations between, say, Georgia and the EU become more difficult and a struggle, specifically because Russia is pushing that wedge issue of LGBTQ rights.
Okay, thanks. Anton, coming back to you pointing out about importance of the Western Europe for the Kremlin. Ivan Krastev actually wrote an excellent piece recently saying something very important, that when the Berlin Wall collapsed, everyone expected that the Eastern Europe will kind of convert to Western values, but everyone thought for some reason that the West will stay the same, like forever. And on this, I would like to ask the question. I think your paper is in many ways about not only analyzing the actions of Kremlin, but to see the whole frame from the beginning till the end, where there is some particular goal and result of any Kremlin's action. So how would we measure a success of the malign influence of Kremlin, particularly talking about Western countries where the European values is actually something stable?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that the crisis that we have today is about Ukraine in predominantly, I would say. It is also about interference in Western democratic processes, but it's mostly about Ukraine because of the sanctions. Yeah? The sanctions they're harmful for Russia. No matter how bold the elites in Russia appear, they are harmful. They would like to the Western nations to lift those sanctions. So if they do this, that would be definitely a success of Russian malign influence operations. If we see that there forms a particular group of countries inside the European Union that will block the extension of the sanctions, because they need to be extended every half a year or every year, then we'll see that these facilitators of Russian malign influence, of Russia's political warfare, have been successful. So that would be, I think, the major success. But also there are smaller successes. Opening up the, I think that the continuation of the Nord Stream 2 is a success of Russian malign influence, using European business networks as facilitators of this influence. So, this is successful. So I would say that sometimes Russia is successful, sometimes it's not. And it's important again to highlight with influence, and the entire concept of influence. Influence is not something that is already a fact. Yeah, it's not necessarily that the influence has been already exerted. No, it's a process. Russia is influencing, and again, it's sometimes it is successful, sometimes it's not. Take for example, because the pandemic. It's very important today. So with Italy, the publicity coup that Putin and Russia did, sending humanitarian help to medical help to Italy, and sending experts to Italy. That was a real publicity coup. There was a lot of videos coming from Italy, but then I think they overplayed it. They almost failed this operation. The La Stampa, one of the biggest newspapers in Italy, it published an article by one investigative journalist who said that, well, 80% of these humanitarian help was useless. And then what happened is that Russia started to overreact to this piece, journalistic piece. The defense ministry criticized the journalist. Then the Italian embassy in Italy criticized the journalist. And they crossed a particular line, because you can't, in a democratic society, you can't just pressure an independent journalist. And then this created a backlash, a really backlash. I would even argue that this publicity coup turned into a soft power failure. They tried to use soft power in this, and they were initially quite successful, I would say. But then I think they failed. Although, of course, yesterday I saw results of a public opinion poll in Italy, and it is quite sad, I would say, to see that the support for the European Union dropped 20%. There's a drop of 20% in the support for the European Union. How much of Kremlin's influence here? I don't know. It's very difficult to measure this, but the fact is that there is now less support for the European Union. Of course, the European Union can also be criticized for the lack of actions from the very beginning of the crisis, or at least they didn't make public all the help that they provided to European member states. But now we have what we have.
Okay, but actually, I would like to follow up a little bit more on this whole coronavirus campaign. I mean, before the whole pandemic actually hit Moscow heavily, what just happened like a couple of days ago, as I understood, the whole narrative of the Russian propaganda together with Chinese was about, look, authoritarian states does really well this pandemic. So, if you Italians will become a little bit more pro-Russian, or, will operate your government in a way we do, then, things like happened in Milan would never happen. That was pretty clear. But how all this will go now, when Russia is really getting collapsed around this pandemic thing? Because on one side, there is like thousands of new cases being identified every day. And on another side, Vladimir Putin is playing the weakest card in like 20 years because he's basically going into self-isolation from his own country and, lifting all the responsibilities on the governors, on other people, on local level, whatever, just not touching anything serious. So does it mean that he will still try to kind of push forward something on the West while actually saving himself from his own polls in Russia? Maria, would you like to answer this?
Greg, yes, thank you, and apologies. I realized that I didn't actually address the first part of the questions earlier about the Russia's goals. I think Anton already did it to a large extent for him, but actually, I will start with answering that question. So, very briefly, the goals of Russia in this pandemic and its influence operations very much aligned with Anton's paper, right? There is a domestic element, which is ultimately improving attitudes towards Russia all over the West and contributing to lifting sanctions. And this is where the medical aid, at least in part, was originally to be instrumental. As a result, unfortunately, as typically happens with the Kremlin's influence operations, it kind of backfired. Anton brilliantly outlined that already, and it's not very clear to what extent Russia will be successful. The war already attempts to raise this issue about the necessity of sanctions in the UN Security Council, and again, only a minority of very really tiny states backed Russia in this effort. Ultimately, you would think that Russia, again, will be stronger against this relative disarray in the West. But the whole oil deal collapse, and again, the image fiasco that Russia experienced recently, again, do not point in that direction. If anything, I think Trump's administration is trying to use Russia's failure to negotiate with OPEC in order to essentially kick Russia out of Venezuela. We'll see how successful it will go, but again, that does not demonstrate that Kremlin has substantive leverage over the situation. And the second goal is, of course, to weaken the EU. We've seen that, for example, the EU Stratcom unit has published a report about how Russia's multiple trolls and Kremlin-linked media spread this disinformation about how the EU is weakened, etc., etc. Again, most likely, Anton gave this data about Italy, we will see certain decline in trust in the EU. It's the result of this pandemic. Nation states will be stronger, but that will unlikely happen primarily because of Russia's disinformation effort. It will be primarily, as again usually happens, driven by just these realities on the ground, where the Kremlin will or will not be able to manipulate the sentiment even further. Most of Russia's effort in Europe has increasingly become toxic over the long term. And so even most devoted Kremlin supporters actually are not very eager to signal their affiliation with the Kremlin in the West. So that's good news. The bad news is, of course, the fact that it is still too early to predict how the pandemic will impact the transatlantic alliance. If anything, the dynamic that was there in the first place before, so the weakening of the transatlantic alliance and the rise of the nation state, it will be intensified. And I think Anton again had a very interesting paper about this proletarization of the far right and how we are likely to see the processes that already have been happening in the EU actually reinforced as these far right and far left forces will probably, against the general dissatisfaction with the mainstream politics, will actually possibly strengthen as a result of these policies. But my key argument, once again, is to try to distinguish the role that the Kremlin plays in this effort as opposed to these real realities on the ground that we observe. And I think there was a great question online about how we could do that. So the good news, there is rising awareness about it, even among major corporations. Facebook, for example, has recently issued a call about more studies on this topic and proposes some funding. So there is causal methods that we could use, especially if we have, as scholars, access to social media data, to see how susceptible certain social groups are to particular type of narratives and how likely they are to share certain information, especially when they are, for example, find themselves under a condition of more distress as pandemic has created. So I think if anything good can come out of that is we actually have this perfect experiment that pandemic has created where we'll be able to study this further.
Okay, thank you. So we got just a few minutes left. I'd like to answer the last question, ask the last question basically to everyone. So, just finalizing the whole conversation, what do you think? I don't know, let's say, if you got really bunch of money and a carte blanche of doing anything to stop Russian influence, what would be the key countries or key regions where you have to invest on this? That's the first question. And then what would be like the key areas which would be more important than other areas of influence to, and where it would be more effective basically to invest and just stop it once and forever. Anton, you first.
Well, okay. If we're talking about countries, I'm originally from Ukraine, so I'm being patriotic here. I think that supporting Ukraine is very important because now the country suffers from multiple crises. It's not only about the pandemic; it's also the ongoing aggression of the Kremlin against Ukraine. So supporting Ukraine it should not disappear from the agenda. So support should be there. Also, the Balkans. I think it's the one of the most important regions where political warfare is going on. Where is the region where the Kremlin does invest a lot of energy and resources to keep this region in the area under the influence of Russia. Then it's obviously the Central East European region. The backsliding on democracy there is quite a serious matter. What we see in Hungary, this is something that should concern us a lot, because the questions are now being asked, like what the European Union is going to do with Hungary. Then there is, for example, there is no mechanism to expel a member state from the European Union. And, there are calls for radical measures, but in reality, if we look at the mechanisms, there's actually very little that the European Union can do. And I believe that Viktor Orban, of course, I completely agree with Maria that there are there are many realities on the ground. There are many organic factors, but Putin's Russia does help. In many instances, with for example, with the populist economy of Viktor Orban, for example, based on very low prices for energy resources for the population, it would not have been successful without a deal with Putin's Russia. It would just not be possible. So this is important, and limiting to a certain extent, as far as possible, this malign influence in Central Eastern Europe is also, I think, a priority.
Okay. Melissa, would you like to add something?
Yes. Building on what Anton said, and being a lawyer, if I had all the money in the world, I would put it toward creating and ensuring independent judiciaries. In Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the Balkans, we're seeing attacks on judiciaries, and if you don't have a functioning judiciary, you can't hold anyone accountable. I would create and ensure that this European Prosecutor's Office is created and would function, and I would say that I would ensure that the EU tying of the budget to rule of law factors, rule of law framework, so that a certain level of rule of law needed to be demonstrated to get money from the EU budget. I would focus on things like that, but then I would also put money towards civil society in especially Central and Eastern Europe, where you have, for example, media consolidation that is either in government hands or close to government hands, government cronies. So I would create more independent media in those areas. And then one final point, I would examine social media as a possible facilitator under Anton's framework in a lot of regions. And so because that's, there are a lot of US factors that connect to that. There are a lot of these companies that are in the US, then I would push the US for more examination and possible regulation of social media. That's it.
Okay. Maria?
I agree with everything that has been said. I would add media literacy projects to this list. It's kind of similar to what Melissa has said, but not exactly, since we need to educate people about better ways to consume information that are presented. There's also a problem with media themselves in everywhere, not just in Central Eastern Europe, for example, but in the United States, we see a lot of that happening too, where essentially the medium ground has disappeared, where we see the lack of moderated analysis very commonly in the mainstream news. So the effort to create this central ground that would have countered also the polarization that it contributes to in the societies would have been quite plausible. And ultimately, when it comes to Ukraine, it's not directly linked to the, our discussion, but somewhat linked. There is also the problem with institutional building. We don't really know how to build good liberal institutions when the conditions that developed, that took centuries in Western societies to develop, are not in place. And again, this is something that kind of sad to realize on the example of Ukraine, but certainly a lot of effort should be directed in that direction as well.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Maria Snegovaya, Melissa Hooper, Anton Shekhovtsov. Thanks for this great discussion today. Thanks, everyone, for watching us. This video will be available, so feel free to share it with your colleagues. The report could be found at Free Russia website. Follow us to know about our upcoming events and reports, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.